If you've ever laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to force your brain to shut off, you know the frustration. You can control your breathing, you can try to clear your thoughts, but you can't simply command your body to fall asleep. There is a reason for that. Sleep isn't just a choice we make, it's a biological process driven by two distinct systems working in the background. The first is something often called sleep pressure. Throughout the day, a chemical called adenosine builds up in your brain, creating a mounting, heavy urge to sleep. The second is your circadian rhythm, your internal biological clock. This clock doesn't just track time, it anticipates it, preparing your body for sleep long before you actually close your eyes. This is where things get complicated. Our internal clock is incredibly sensitive to light. Researchers have found that our eyes contain a specific type of photoreceptor, a pigment that is distinct from the ones we use for vision, that is particularly sensitive to certain wavelengths of light. Specifically, research has identified a wavelength range between 446 and 4777 nanometers as the most potent trigger for suppressing melatonin. Melatonin is the hormone that signals to your body that it's time to wind down. When light in this range hits our eyes, it can delay the biological signal to sleep. This biological sensitivity exists alongside a different kind of struggle, a mismatch between our internal clocks and our social obligations, a phenomenon researchers call social jet lag. It's the discrepancy between your internal biological time and the social time dictated by your obligations, like work or school. In industrialized countries, it's estimated that 2/3 of the studying and working population experiences this mismatch. We are essentially living in two different time zones, one dictated by our biology and one dictated by the alarm clock. We often try to fix this by changing our habits. For example, one study looked at whether reducing blue light in the evening could help. They found that while reducing evening blue light did help people fall asleep earlier on workdays and advance their melatonin secretion, it didn't actually reduce social jet lag itself. The biological reality is that, while we can nudge the timing of our melatonin or our sleep onset, we are still fighting against a structural mismatch. We are trying to use willpower to override a deeply ingrained, light-sensitive biological system that is increasingly at odds with the world we've built around it. This isn't the jet lag you feel after a flight to a new time zone. It's the chronic discrepancy between when your body wants to sleep and when the world, school, work, the morning commute demands that you wake up. It's the gap between your weekday schedule and your free days. We actually got a glimpse of what happens when that social pressure is suddenly lifted. During the COVID-19 lockdowns, a survey of over 7,000 adults across 40 countries captured a shift in sleep patterns. Without the rigid structure of the office or the school run, people's biological and social times began to realign. On workdays, people were sleeping about 26 minutes longer, while on their free days, they were actually sleeping slightly less. This effectively reduced their social jet lag by about 30 minutes. The researchers behind that study suggested that a tolerable level of social jet lag is roughly 20 minutes. But for many, the gap is much wider. And when that gap persists, it isn't just a matter of feeling tired on Monday mornings, it appears to have measurable costs for our physical and mental health. For children and adolescents, the stakes are particularly high. An observational study looking at early adolescence found a link between high levels of social jet lag and certain metabolic markers in girls. Specifically, researchers noted associations between social jet lag and higher BMI, increased waist-to-height ratios, and higher systolic blood pressure. While these findings show a correlation rather than a direct cause, they suggest that when a teenager's biological rhythm is constantly fighting the school bell, it may place a strain on their body's ability to regulate energy. This friction seems to impact cognitive performance as well. In a study of 350 children with ADHD, researchers found that higher social jet lag, the mismatch between school nights and weekend nights, was associated with slower processing speed and lower scores in both visual and language-based reasoning. Interestingly, while time in bed and sleep disturbances showed few such associations, social jet lag appeared to be a key factor in these cognitive outcomes for the children in this study. When we look at these patterns, it becomes harder to view sleep deprivation as merely a personal failure of discipline or a lack of sleep hygiene. If the very structure of our social lives, the way we schedule school and work, is fundamentally out of sync with our biological reality, then social jet lag isn't just a side effect of a busy life. It is a structural mismatch, a constant, low-grade collision between the way our bodies evolved to function and the way modern society is organized. If social jet lag is a mismatch between our biological clocks and our social lives, then shift work is a forced, permanent collision. For much of the modern economy, the world doesn't just ask us to adjust, it asks us to operate in direct opposition to our own biology. We often think of sleep deprivation as a personal struggle, a byproduct of staying up too late or having a demanding job. And for those working the night or rotating shifts, the struggle isn't about willpower. It's about a structural requirement. Consider a study of 109 industrial workers in Germany that tracked their sleep over a 28-day period. The researchers looked at how different types of schedules affected their rest. What they found was that while the average amount of sleep across all groups was about 6.5 hours, the timing and quality of that sleep varied wildly depending on the roster. The workers on 12-hour rotating shifts faced a particularly brutal reality. On their actual workdays, their sleep plummeted, averaging only 5 hours. Because they were constantly spinning their internal clocks to keep up with the rotation, they ended up with the highest overall sleep debt of any group. Then there are the permanent night workers. They don't have to rotate, but they pay a different kind of price. These workers showed the highest levels of social jet lag, a measure of how much a person's biological clock is out of sync with their social environment. In this study, their social jet lag was over 5 hours. I also reported the poorest sleep quality and tended to stay awake much later into the morning, even on their days off, as their bodies struggled to anchor themselves to any consistent rhythm. And when we look at the people who make our essential services run, the healthcare workers, the human toll becomes even clearer. Data from the E4 night study, which followed nearly 1,000 workers across Europe, found that permanent night shift workers reported the poorest sleep duration and quality of all. In this cohort, 27% of participants reported experiencing anxiety and 18% reported depression. There is a heavy, systemic weight to this. When we talk about the cost of a 24-hour society, we are often talking about the health and mental well-being of a specific subset of the workforce. In these moments, the mismatch between a person's biological state and their professional responsibilities becomes a matter of health and safety. As we move through a world that never sleeps, we have to consider the challenges facing people who work against their own internal clocks. If the social cost of a 24/7 economy is measured in exhausted workers, there are also observed associations between these schedules and changes in metabolism. When we disrupt our sleep-wake cycles, we aren't just feeling tired, we are potentially disrupting the rhythms that help our organs manage energy. To understand this, we have to look at how our bodies process fuel. Most of us think of metabolism as a constant, steady engine, but it is actually a rhythmic process. It relies on a predictable dance between our internal clock and the food we eat. When that rhythm is broken, when we work shifts or live in a state of constant social jet lag, the dance falls out of sync. Data from a large study of women in South Korea, tracking thousands of participants between 2019 and 2021, shows what happens when that rhythm breaks. Researchers found that shift workers had 1.30 times higher odds of having elevated insulin resistance compared to those working day shifts. For those who don't know, insulin resistance is a precursor to type 2 diabetes. It's the state where your cells stop responding effectively to the hormone that manages your blood sugar, leaving more glucose circulating in your bloodstream. The study found that this wasn't a uniform effect. The strongest associations were observed in women aged 40 to 50 and in those in pink-collar occupations roles that often involve irregular hours or service-oriented shifts. The researchers suggested that women may be more vulnerable to these metabolic disturbances, likely due to the way specific hormonal profiles interact with circadian rhythms. This connection between light, time, and hormones suggests that our modern environment may be increasingly at odds with our biological rhythms. For instance, there is research into the impact of artificial light at night, the glow from our streets, our screens, and our office lights. There is evidence that this constant nocturnal light can disrupt the endocrine system, potentially leading to irregular menstrual cycles or altered hormone levels. It is important to note, however, that much of what we know about these specific hormonal mechanisms comes from animal models. We are still working to prove exactly how this translates to human biology, and researchers are increasingly looking into these potential links. But it isn't just about when you work, it's also about who you are naturally. Some of us are simply evening types, the natural night owls who feel most alert when the sun goes down. While society often treats being a night owl as a personality trait or a lifestyle choice, it carries its own metabolic weight. A study of middle-aged adults in Korea found that being an evening type was independently associated with diabetes and metabolic syndrome. For women in that study, being a natural night owl was specifically associated with a significantly higher odds ratio for metabolic syndrome. Even when researchers accounted for how long these people slept or their general lifestyle, the association remained. When we talk about the mismatch between our biological clocks and the demands of modern life, we often focus on the feeling of being tired. But research suggests this mismatch is associated with more than just fatigue. There is a documented link between these misaligned schedules and various health outcomes, suggesting that the struggle to stay in sync with a modern schedule may have deeper physiological implications. This mismatch is perhaps most visible during the transition into adolescence. For many teenagers, the difficulty of waking up for school is often linked to a relationship between a changing biology and a rigid social schedule. As adolescents move into puberty, their internal clocks undergo a natural shift. Their bodies begin to release melatonin, the hormone that signals it's time to sleep, much later in the evening than they did as children. This biological delay means that for a teenager, the natural urge to sleep might not arrive until late at night, yet the requirements of the modern school day demand they be awake and functioning at the crack of dawn. This discrepancy between biological and social time is known as social jet lag. In a study of emerging adults, researchers found that people often experience an average shift of about an hour and a half between their weekday and weekend sleep schedules. For about 30% of those studied, this shift was large enough to reach a threshold of clinical significance. When this happens every single day, it isn't just a matter of being a little groggy in first period. A review of recent studies suggests that for a large portion of the adolescent population, this mismatch leads to chronic sleep restriction. It's a cycle of disrupted sleep-wake rhythms that can compromise daytime functioning and, crucially, decrease a student's ability to learn. But these associations aren't just cognitive. Research has found links between these misaligned schedules and various metabolic risks in specific populations, such as girls in early adolescence and middle-aged adults in certain studies. In a study of 605 adolescents in Brazil, researchers found that those reporting less than 8 hours of sleep per night had higher median BMI, waist circumference, and neck circumference compared to those with adequate sleep. The study authors concluded that sleep deprivation was associated with a specific pattern of centripetal distribution of fat, a concentration of fat around the midsection. The study also looked at physiological markers in a subsample of 81 adolescents. In that group, those who reported sleeping less than 8 hours a night had a significantly lower median insulin sensitivity index, a measure of how effectively the body processes sugar compared to those with adequate sleep. It is important to be clear, these studies show a strong association, but they don't prove a direct causal link. While these findings show a clear link between sleep and metabolic health, the researchers noted that even after accounting for age and sex, sleep deprivation remained an independent predictor of higher BMI and central fat distribution in the adolescents studied. We've talked about how our internal clocks clash with the world around us, but there is another, more structural layer to this mismatch. It isn't just about when the lights go out, but about the environment in which we try to sleep and the resources we have to protect that time. To understand this, we have to look back at the very beginning of life. A long-term study of over 14,000 women and their children in the UK found that material deprivation and family income are associated with the odds of a child having sleep problems. Researchers looked at things like family income and material deprivation, essentially, how many basic necessities a family might struggle to afford. What they found was that for children up to age 9, sleep quantity, the actual number of hours spent in bed, didn't seem to change much based on wealth, but the problems associated with sleep changed significantly. For every additional item of material deprivation a child faced, the odds of them having at least one sleep problem increased by roughly 10 to 20%. On the other end of the spectrum, children from the wealthiest families saw a 20% reduction in the odds of experiencing sleep problems. While the number of hours a child spends sleeping may not change much based on wealth, the stability and environment provided by family income appear to play a significant role in the likelihood of sleep problems. As we move through life, this pattern doesn't disappear, it often hardens. During the COVID-19 pandemic, researchers looked at over 7,000 older adults in England to see how socioeconomic factors influenced sleep. They found that lower levels of education and greater financial hardship, or even just the constant worry about future financial stability, were tied to poorer self-reported sleep quality. The researchers found that while lower education was linked to poor sleep through financial variables, factors like mental health and physical health also acted as independent risk factors for poor sleep quality in these older adults. This creates a particularly difficult situation for parents living in low-income households. When we look at the intersection of demographic risks, things like unemployment or single motherhood, and sleep, we see a pattern of physiological stress. Research has shown that poor sleep is significantly associated with increased physiological stress, specifically measured through levels of cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone. For these parents, the evidence suggests that poor sleep can be a predictor of worsened mental health outcomes, including increased symptoms of anxiety and depression. When we view sleep this way, it stops being just a personal habit or a matter of sleep hygiene. We often talk about sleep as a choice, a decision to put down the phone or go to bed earlier. Research has suggested that factors like material deprivation and family income are associated with an increased likelihood of sleep problems in children. For many, this means that the ability to achieve restorative, uninterrupted sleep can be tied to socioeconomic circumstances. But while we've been talking about how socioeconomic factors can shape our rest, there is a small group of people for whom the standard rules just don't seem to apply. Most of us know the feeling of a sleep debt, that heavy, foggy sensation after a late night, or the desperate need for a weekend nap to catch up. But for a tiny fraction of the population, estimated at less than 1%, that debt doesn't seem to exist. These are the natural short sleepers. Take Lindsay Hudson, a nurse practitioner. Since her teenage years, she has felt energized and alert on just 4.5 to 6.5 hours of sleep. But for her, more sleep isn't a luxury, it's a problem. If she sleeps more than 7 hours, she says she feels foggy or even hungover. Then there is Joanne Osmond, a 77-year-old who has lived this way her entire life. For her, being a short sleeper comes with a specific kind of social cost, a sense of isolation, being wide awake and active in the early morning hours while the rest of her family is still asleep. For a long time, these experiences were dismissed as outliers or perhaps just people who were very good at ignoring their exhaustion. But genetic research has begun to suggest that, for some, this isn't a choice or a habit. It might be hardwired. In a 2009 study, research led by Dr. Ying-Hu Fu found that individuals with a mutation on the D2 gene averaged 6.25 hours of sleep per night compared to an average of 8.6 hours in those without the mutation. Scientists are also investigating other markers, like the NEP133 mutation in the Psych3 gene in laboratory mice. This specific mutation was found to reduce sleep by an average of 30 minutes per night. Dr. Fu has also proposed the hypothesis that the DEC2 mutation might increase levels of orexin, a neuropeptide that plays a role in regulating the sleep cycle. This discovery has sparked a debate: are these people actually thriving, or are they just incredibly good at masking the symptoms of sleep deprivation? While chronic sleep deprivation is linked to heart disease and Alzheimer's, the science of sleep is still full of unanswered questions. However, mouse studies have shown that mice with certain short sleep genes actually accumulate fewer of the abnormal proteins associated with Alzheimer's. Dr. Ptadek, a researcher in this field, notes that while this doesn't prove that short sleepers live longer in humans, it does suggest that these mutations might allow the brain to perform housekeeping tasks, like clearing out cellular waste, much more efficiently. But there is a catch. While these genetic outliers might be fine, many others are not. The CDC reports that about 35% of Americans get insufficient sleep, a figure that highlights how common sleep deprivation is in the general population. Recent brain imaging studies have added another layer of doubt to the supersleeper narrative. Using fMRI scans, researchers from the Human Connectome Project looked at the brain activity of people who report sleeping very little. They found that even among those who claimed they felt perfectly fine during the day, their brains showed signatures of diminished wakefulness. Researchers suggest this could be a candidate mechanism for why some people might not accurately perceive how impaired they actually are. So, we are left with a fundamental tension. On one hand, there is the possibility of a rare biological superpower, a genetic efficiency that allows a few to thrive on less. On the other, researchers have suggested the possibility that some people may have an inaccurate perception of their own functionality, that they may feel fine even when their brain scans show signs of diminished wakefulness. Some experts suggest that our modern habit of sleeping in one long block, a monophasic pattern, might be a result of sociological changes like the Industrial Revolution rather than a biological necessity. This leads to a question. Was our ancestors' sleep actually more fragmented? To see what we might be missing, researchers have looked toward populations living in much more traditional ways. For example, during the 20-day study tracking 33 Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, researchers used wrist-worn devices to monitor sleep patterns. What they found was striking. In a total of 220 hours of observation, there were only 18 minutes where the entire group was asleep at the same time. On average, at any given moment, more than a third of the tribe was either awake or dozing lightly. They woke up to smoke, to relieve themselves, or to tend to a crying baby. There was also a generational rhythm to it. The older members tended to be larks, waking early, while the younger members stayed up later. This pattern suggests a theory called the sentinel hypothesis. The idea is that this fragmentation wasn't a bug, but a feature, an evolutionary survival mechanism. Researchers suggest that if the group is rarely entirely asleep at once, it may have served as a mechanism to ensure some members remained alert to nocturnal threats, a form of collective vigilance. When researchers compared this to modern populations, the data showed a gradient in nighttime awakenings, or wakefulness after sleep onset. In the study, non-Hispanic white Americans had the lowest average, with 0.69 hours of wakefulness after falling asleep. The Hadza averaged 244 hours of nighttime awakenings, while Malagasy small-scale agriculturalists averaged 103 hours. Interestingly, within a Hispanic sample, researchers found that higher levels of nighttime wakefulness were linked to a higher perception of neighborhood violence. This suggests that our sleep patterns might reflect how safe we feel in our environment. But this leads to a debate among anthropologists about how we define normal sleep. There is a concept called segmented sleep, where people sleep in two distinct shifts with a period of wakefulness in between. Some researchers once argued that this pattern was just a side effect of long winter nights in northern latitudes. However, other scholars find that conclusion highly questionable. They point to ethnographic evidence from equatorial cultures where the nights don't change much, showing that segmented sleep has been a common human experience for a very long time. David Samsom, a researcher at Duke University, notes that while Westerners enjoy what he calls secure, decent sleep, we also deal with much higher levels of insomnia and sleep-related paranoia. It raises a question about the nature of our modern sleep patterns. While some might view the 8-hour, uninterrupted sleep cycle as a biological ideal, others suggest the shift to this modern monophasic pattern may be driven more by sociological factors than by biology. Researchers like Charlie Nunn have suggested that our modern sleep patterns might actually be a relic of an evolutionary past, a mismatch between our ancient systems for vigilance and the much safer environments we live in today. If our modern sleep is fundamentally unnatural, we have to ask, what is the biological cost of that mismatch? We often think of sleep deprivation as a temporary fog, a morning of grogginess or a mid-afternoon slump. But beneath that surface-level fatigue, there is a much more profound, cellular process of maintenance that relies on a steady, predictable rhythm. To understand how sleep disruption might accelerate cognitive decline, we have to look at the brain's internal cleaning system. There is a process called autophagy, which is essentially a cellular recycling mechanism. It's how neurons break down and clear out damaged components to keep the system running smoothly. Research suggests that adequate sleep supports these autophagic processes, helping the brain manage its own waste. When we deprive ourselves of sleep, we disrupt that recycling. While the exact link to Alzheimer's is still being studied, mouse models have shown that certain mutations, such as those in the DT gene, may offer protection against the accumulation of proteins associated with the disease. Some researchers suggest these mutations might allow for more efficient physiological processes, like waste clearance, though the link to human longevity remains a hypothesis. But research suggests that the impact of sleep disruption might involve more than just what the brain fails to clear away. It may also involve what the brain fails to build. To see how circadian disruption affects the physical structure of the brain, researchers have looked at neurogenesis, the process by which the brain produces new neurons, particularly in the hippocampus, an area vital for learning and memory. In a study involving female hamsters, researchers simulated jet lag by constantly shifting the light and dark cycles. They found that this constant disruption significantly reduced the production of new cells in the hippocampus. It is important to note that these findings come from animal models, and we cannot assume the exact same mechanism applies to humans. However, the implications for these animals were striking. The researchers observed that the resulting deficits in learning and memory persisted even after the sleep disruption ended. This suggests that in the case of these hamsters, the brain's ability to learn didn't just bounce back the moment the rhythm was restored. Though, again, we cannot assume these results translate directly to humans. There is a concerning association here. Clinical reviews indicate that sleep disturbances are a major concern for people living with dementia, and that these sleep problems are associated with a faster progression of cognitive decline. This creates a heavy burden not just for the individual, but for the caregivers who must navigate the unpredictable cycles of a brain that can no longer regulate its own rest. The American Heart Association has noted that this isn't just a matter of being tired, it's linked to serious cardiometabolic risks. As people increasingly choose to curtail sleep for work, for social lives, or for leisure, we are seeing a decline in average sleep duration. This shift is associated with health risks, as the association has linked short sleep duration to issues like obesity, hypertension, and type 2 diabetes. But there is a deeper, more systemic tension at play here. It's the friction between what our bodies evolved to need and the social structures we've built. We see this even in how we define normal sleep. Some researchers in biological anthropology argue that our modern Western medical standards for sleep, like the emphasis on solitary sleeping for infants, might actually be prioritizing social values over our evolutionary heritage. They suggest that by ignoring how humans have historically slept, such as through shared infant sleep, we might be missing critical biological insights into health and safety. When you layer these factors together, including the theory that the Industrial Revolution may have driven a shift toward monophasic sleep, alongside modern social and economic pressures, we face a complex landscape. Some research posits that insufficient sleep can lead to far-reaching economic consequences, affecting productivity and well-being. It's about a tension between our biological rhythms and our social clocks. Since social and economic structures are often associated with sleep disruption and various health risks, some argue that we should consider these broader factors alongside individual habits like sleep hygiene. It raises the question of whether it is possible to maintain health in a society where schedules often mismatch our biological rhythms.